The moon hung low and heavy over the thick, misty forest that bordered the small, isolated village in rural Japan. It was the kind of night where the wind whispered through the trees, almost like it was trying to tell secrets, but no one was there to listen. The air felt colder than it should have been for autumn, and a quiet dread seemed to settle over the village, as though something unseen was lurking just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlights. In the distance, the dim shapes of old houses, worn by time and weather, stood like forgotten memories. Their walls, cracked and crooked, seemed to lean in on each other, like they were whispering of things better left untouched. The village children were always warned never to stay out too late. The old ones, those who had seen more than a lifetime's worth of seasons, would whisper in hushed voices of a girl, pale as death, who had no shadow. "Don't be like her," they would say. "She follows children home at night." But the story, of course, was just a story, or so the children believed. One such child was Emiko, a curious, bright-eyed girl of 11. She had always been drawn to the mystery of the forest, even though the older villagers warned her to stay far away. But Emiko was bold, and on nights when the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, she would sneak into the woods with her friends, Hiroshi and Akira. They had heard the whispers of the Shadowless girl, but had always laughed them off. That night, however, something felt different. It had started as any other evening. The three of them had been playing hide-and-seek in the woods, daring each other to go deeper into the darkening trees. Emiko had been hiding behind an ancient oak when she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, not quite a crunch, but a dragging, like someone was trying to move quietly but failing. At first, Emiko thought it was just one of her friends coming to find her. But as the sound got closer, she felt her heart pound in her chest. She peeked around the tree, her eyes wide. There, standing in the dim moonlight, was a girl. She was standing still, her pale face expressionless, her long black hair flowing down her back like a waterfall of ink. But it was not her face that terrified Emiko, it was her body. The girl had no shadow. The ground beneath her feet seemed to swallow the faint light around her, as though the darkness itself was afraid of her presence. Emiko's breath caught in her throat. She tried to call out to her friends, but her voice was a whisper lost in the wind. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't move. The shadowless girl took a step forward, her feet dragging behind her, as though she was floating just above the ground. Hiroshi and Akira suddenly appeared behind Emiko, laughing and not noticing the presence that stood before them. But Emiko grabbed their arms, her grip icy and tight. "Don't look," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's here, the shadowless girl." Akira laughed, thinking Emiko was just playing another prank. "You're always so scared of stories, Emiko." But Hiroshi, sensing the fear in her, followed her eyes. His gaze shifted to the girl in the clearing. For a moment, there was silence. And then the girl took another step closer, and the wind seemed to die completely. It was as if the world had frozen in time. "Run," whispered Emiko, pushing her friends away. "Run." But it was too late. The shadowless girl moved faster than they could react. In one moment, she was standing at the edge of the clearing. In the next, she was inches away from them, her eyes empty as she stared at them with a cold, unnerving gaze. Hiroshi, his face pale, took a step back. "What do you want?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached out with a cold, skeletal hand, brushing Akira's cheek. The touch sent a chill through his body, as if every ounce of warmth had been sucked from him. A guttural whisper escaped her lips, "Go home." But it wasn't a command. It was a promise. The moment she spoke, Akira's eyes widened in terror. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. The shadowless girl's gaze never left him. Emiko, tears welling in her eyes, grabbed Hiroshi's hand and pulled him in the direction of the village. She screamed for Akira to follow, but he was still frozen, his body trembling uncontrollably. The shadowless girl's laughter echoed behind them, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. The next day, the village was abuzz with whispers. Akira was missing. No one had seen him since the night before. No one had heard him call out. When the villagers found the place where Emiko, Hiroshi, and Akira had last been. They found only Akira's shoes, left in the dirt at the edge of the clearing. The rest of him was gone. As the years passed, the village would change, but the story of the girl with no shadow never would. Some say she still follows children, watching them from the woods, waiting for the moment when they're brave enough to venture too far from the safety of the village. Others believe she has claimed many more, her hunger never satisfied. But no one knows for sure. All that's certain is that when the wind blows too quietly, and the shadows seem to stretch just a little too long, there's something out there, watching, waiting. And if you're unlucky enough to walk alone at night, you might just hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging, getting closer. And in the distance, you might catch a glimpse of a pale figure, standing without a shadow. It was a year after Akira had vanished, and the village still seemed haunted by the memory of that dreadful night. The leaves had begun to fall again, and the cold, biting wind that blew through the forest carried with it a feeling of something lost, something unfinished. Children whispered more softly now, as they walked home from school, casting nervous glances at the trees that stood at the edge of the village. No one dared speak of Akira. It was as if saying his name would summon the Shadowless girl again. Yet, life moved on in the village, as it always did. The older generation would sit in the dimly lit inns, telling stories of the past, their voices low and tinged with regret. The younger villagers, those who had not witnessed the terrifying events themselves, began to forget. It was only a story now, a ghost story told in the fading warmth of summer nights. But for Emiko, the memory never faded. Emiko was different now, quieter, more withdrawn. She was no longer the curious, bold girl she had once been. The forest, which had once been a place of adventure and wonder, now felt like an impenetrable maze of darkness and shadows. The day after Akira disappeared, she had promised herself she would never return to the woods. The girl with no shadow had claimed her friend, and Emiko could feel the weight of that promise pressing on her chest every time she ventured too close to the edge of the trees. Still, life had its way of pushing people into uncomfortable situations, and one such moment came on a bitterly cold evening as Emiko was walking home from school. The village was already cloaked in the gloom of dusk, and the wind whipped through the narrow streets, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The clouds hung low in the sky, casting an eerie, gray light over everything. The forest was still, as it always was at twilight, quiet yet ominous. Emiko hurried along the path, her heart beating faster than usual. She had never been afraid of the walk home before, but tonight was different. She had heard whispers earlier in the day, voices carried on the wind. "She's back," they said. "The Shadowless girl is back." At first, Emiko tried to shake the thoughts from her mind. It had been a year, after all. Surely, it was just the villagers' fears manifesting once again. But as she passed the edge of the forest, she felt a familiar chill creeping up her spine, as if the trees themselves were watching her. It wasn't until she reached the familiar gate of her home that she finally allowed herself to breathe. The small, weathered house, with its cracked windows and creaking roof, had always been a place of comfort for her. But tonight, even the warm glow from within seemed distant, as if it couldn't protect her from what was lurking outside. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by her mother's soft voice. "You're late, Emiko. You know better than to stay out after dark." "I know, Mama," Emiko replied, her voice distant. "I'm sorry." Her mother didn't press the matter, but Emiko could see the worry in her eyes. There was something different about her mother these days, her once bright face now shadowed with an inexplicable fear. It was as if she, too, knew something that Emiko didn't. After dinner, Emiko tried to focus on her schoolwork, but her mind kept drifting back to the forest. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly. She closed her eyes for a moment, hoping to calm the storm in her thoughts. That's when she heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like someone walking through the leaves. Her heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she moved to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered out into the dark night. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the village square was eerily empty. but she could have sworn she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, pale, motionless, and watching. Emiko's pulse quickened. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was nothing. Yet her legs felt heavy, her feet frozen to the spot. She knew who it was. She knew what it meant. The shadowless girl was back. That night, Emiko couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and every creak of the house seemed to echo in her ears. She tossed and turned, unable to escape the images that filled her mind. The pale face of the girl, the empty gaze, the sense of something following her, always just out of reach. Around midnight, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps dragging through the dirt, slow and deliberate. The sound was closer now, almost as if it were right outside her window. This time, Emiko didn't hesitate. She grabbed the small lantern on her bedside table and opened the window, peering out into the dark. The mist had rolled in thickly, so thick that she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. But there was something there, something moving in the fog. A shape, faint and indistinct, standing in the garden below. Emiko's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. "She's here," she whispered to herself. "She's back." The dragging sound continued, growing louder and more distinct. Emiko felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the relentless pull of the unknown. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. A soft, hollow sound, like the tap of a finger on wood. Emiko froze. She didn't move. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who could be knocking at this hour? Another knock, louder this time. Emiko slowly rose from her bed, her feet heavy with dread. She hesitated before moving to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, there was no one there, only the cold, damp air of the night. But as she stepped outside, she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The wind had died down completely. The silence was suffocating. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The pale figure standing in the garden, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. She knew who it was, even before the figure turned to face her. The shadowless girl. The next morning, Emiko was found standing at the edge of the forest, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She could barely speak, only able to mutter a single word. "Her!" When the villagers tried to calm her, she collapsed into their arms, trembling violently. They had seen this before, though never to this extent. Emiko had seen something in the woods, something that no one could explain. The older villagers, those who knew the ancient legends, spoke in hushed tones. "The girl with no shadow is cursed," they said. "She takes those who dare to look too closely. She feeds on their fear, their sorrow, and then she leaves them, empty." The elder who spoke these words was Grandmother Suki, the oldest resident in the village. Her eyes were clouded with age, but there was a depth of wisdom in them that made her words hold weight. "She is a vengeful spirit," Grandmother Suki continued. "Once she marks you, she will never let you go. And she has marked Emiko." The villagers gathered around, uncertain of what to do. The fear in Emiko's eyes was real, and they all knew the stories. Stories of children who had disappeared without a trace. Stories of those who had seen the girl with no shadow and were never the same again. But Emiko was still alive, and that meant there was still a chance to stop the girl with no shadow from claiming another soul. Days passed, but Emiko's condition didn't improve. She spent most of her time staring blankly into space, her once bright eyes now hollow and distant. Her mother, frantic with worry, sought help from a traveling monk who had once helped the village with spiritual matters. The monk arrived late one afternoon, his robes swaying in the cold wind. He was an older man, his face worn by age and experience, but there was a calmness to him that put the villagers at ease. He listened patiently to Emiko's story, nodding slowly as he took in the details. "It is as I feared," he said softly. "The shadowless girl is not just a ghost. She is a lost soul, bound to this world by something unforgivable." He spoke of rituals and rites to banish the spirit, but the process was not simple. The shadowless girl could not be banished easily. She had to be confronted in the place where she had first appeared. the very forest where Emiko had seen her. The monks' plan was dangerous, but it was the only chance they had to save Emiko. The villagers, though afraid, gathered their courage, knowing what had to be done. The time had come. The night of the ritual arrived sooner than anyone expected. The wind howled through the trees as if it were urging the villagers to act quickly. Emiko had grown weaker with each passing day, her once bright eyes now clouded with an emptiness that terrified her mother. She barely spoke anymore, her gaze forever turned toward the dark expanse of the forest, where the shadowless girl still lingered, just out of sight. The villagers, led by Grandmother Suki and the traveling monk, gathered in the square. The tension in the air was thick. Everyone knew the danger of what they were about to attempt. The forest, usually a place of quiet beauty, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it were alive and aware of their presence. Grandmother Suki gathered the group together in the old shrine near the edge of the village, its walls worn and cracked from years of neglect. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of incense and ancient dust. The monk stood at the center, surrounded by candles, his eyes closed in deep concentration as he prepared for the ritual. "Tonight, we will confront the shadowless girl," the monk said, his voice steady but serious. "The forest will not give her up easily, but we must be resolute. We cannot allow her to claim any more souls." The villagers nodded in agreement, though fear was etched on their faces. They had heard the stories, the rumors, the whispers of children who had vanished into the night, never to return. No one truly understood what the shadowless girl was, or why she sought to take the lives of innocent children. But one thing was clear: she was real, and her presence had cast a dark shadow over the village for far too long. With Emiko in tow, the group ventured into the forest, the lanterns casting a flickering light on the narrow path ahead. The air grew colder with every step, the mist thickening as if to conceal them from the rest of the world. The trees, towering and ancient, seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching impossibly long. They walked in silence, each person focused on the task at hand. The monk led the way, his staff tapping against the ground with each step. Grandmother Suki held a bundle of herbs and sacred scrolls in her hands, muttering a prayer under her breath. The others followed closely behind, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths shallow from the cold. It wasn't long before they reached the clearing, the same place where Emiko had seen the girl with no shadow. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, leaving the forest in complete darkness. But in the center of the clearing, a faint glow seemed to emanate from the ground, like something from another world. The monk stopped, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. "This is the place," he said, his voice low. "We must act quickly." He began to chant, his words foreign and heavy with power. The candles around him flickered and danced, casting strange, twisting shadows on the trees. The air grew still, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. For a moment, nothing moved. But then the sound of footsteps, soft and slow, like the dragging of a foot against dirt, cut through the silence. Everyone froze. Emiko, her face pale and drawn, looked around, her eyes wide with terror. She could feel it again, the cold, the weight of something watching her, drawing nearer with each passing second. And then, out of the darkness, she saw it. The girl. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dark. Her long black hair hung down in front of her face, obscuring her features. But Emiko knew who she was. She knew it without having to see the girl's eyes, without needing to hear her voice. The shadowless girl was here. The monk's chanting grew louder, more insistent, as he raised his staff above his head. The air around them crackled with energy, the ground beneath their feet trembling with unseen power. But the girl with no shadow didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her face hidden by her hair, as if waiting for them to make the first move. Grandmother Suki stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "You are not welcome here," she called out. "Leave this place, spirit. Your time in this world is over." The shadowless girl didn't respond. Instead, she took a step forward, dragging her foot behind her in a slow, deliberate motion. The sound was deafening in the silence of the forest, each step sending a chill through Emiko's spine. Suddenly, the girl lifted her head, and Emiko could see her face. But there was nothing human in it. Her features were twisted, her eyes hollow and black as coal, her mouth stretching into a grotesque, silent grin. The shadows seemed to gather around her, swirling and shifting like a living thing, as though they were part of her, an extension of her very being. "Leave." The voice came, not from the girl's mouth, but from everywhere at once, a whisper that seemed to echo in Emiko's mind, twisting and warping like a nightmare. "Leave now, or you will join me." The monk's chanting grew louder, more urgent. His hands moved in intricate patterns as he invoked the final words of the ritual. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the air grew thick with an unnatural pressure. But still, the shadowless girl did not move. She was only staring at them, her empty gaze focused entirely on Emiko. The shadows around her deepened, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable cold. Emiko felt something stir within her, a pull, something dark and irresistible. It was the same feeling she had experienced the night she first saw the girl, the feeling of being drawn toward her, toward the emptiness that surrounded her. She felt herself take a step forward, almost without thinking. But then, the monk raised his staff high and slammed it into the ground. The sound echoed like thunder, shaking the very trees around them. "Begone, spirit!" the monk shouted, his voice filled with power. "You have no claim here." The shadowless girl recoiled, as if struck by an invisible force. Her form flickered for a moment, like a candle's flame about to go out. But then, with a screech that tore through the night, she lunged forward, faster than any of them could react. In that moment, Emiko felt a searing pain in her chest, as if the very air had turned to fire. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her vision blurring. The girl with no shadow was right in front of her now, her hollow eyes staring into hers, a twisted smile spreading across her face. And for a brief moment, Emiko saw something in those eyes, a flicker of humanity, a soul trapped in an eternal prison. And then, with a sound like breaking glass, the shadowless girl vanished. The forest fell silent. The moon broke through the clouds, casting its pale light across the clearing. The candles that had once flickered in the monk's circle now burned brightly, their flames steady and strong. The air was still, the weight of fear lifting from the land like a forgotten nightmare. Emiko blinked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt different. The oppressive sense of being watched had vanished, leaving her feeling strangely light, as if the darkness had been lifted from her shoulders. The monk lowered his staff and turned to Emiko. "It is done," he said softly. "You are free." Grandmother Suki stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "The curse has been lifted," she said. "But the shadowless girl was once a child, just like you. A child who was lost and forgotten, her soul trapped in the darkness. She sought only to be seen, to be acknowledged." Emiko looked down at her hands, still trembling. "But why did she choose me?" she whispered. "Why did she come for me?" Grandmother Suki shook her head. The shadowless girl was born from the fears of the villagers, their inability to protect their children, their unwillingness to face the darkness in their hearts. She was not born of malice, but of neglect. And in her desperation, she sought to claim the souls of those who ventured too close to the void. Emiko nodded slowly, the weight of the story settling over her like a blanket. She had been a part of it, but now she was free. As the villagers made their way back to the safety of their homes, Emiko looked over her shoulder one last time. The forest was still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it no longer seemed like a place of fear. The girl with no shadow was gone, but Emiko knew something would remain, something she would carry with her always. A reminder that darkness, no matter how deep, could be faced. And sometimes, when you confront it head-on, the shadows disappear. The village would never forget the shadowless girl, nor the girl who had been brave enough to face her. And while Emiko had survived, the memory of that night would stay with her forever. As the days passed, Emiko tried to return to her normal life. But things had changed, and the village, once filled with the warmth of community, now felt colder. She found herself wandering the narrow streets in silence, unable to shake the haunting memories of the girl with no shadow. Though the villagers had resumed their daily routines, there was an unspoken unease that lingered in the air, like an unseen specter. Emiko often found herself standing at the edge of the forest, looking into the dense woods that had once seemed like a place of mystery and adventure. Now it felt different, darker, more threatening. She had been changed by what had happened, and the shadows in the forest no longer felt like a backdrop for childhood games, but a looming presence that would never let her go. One afternoon, as Emiko stood by the old stone well near the village square, Hiro, a childhood friend of hers, approached. He had been one of the few who had stuck by her when she had returned from the forest after the ritual. His brown eyes were filled with concern, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. "Emiko," he called softly, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history. "You've been so quiet lately. What's wrong?" She turned to him slowly, a faint smile pulling at her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. She could tell that Hiro wasn't fooled by her facade. He knew her too well. "I'm just tired, Hiro," she said, trying to sound casual. "I think everything that happened, it's just catching up with me." He nodded but didn't seem convinced. "You've been through a lot, I get it, but you're not alone. You know that, right?" Emiko didn't answer right away. Instead, she cast her gaze back toward the forest, where the last traces of sunlight were fading behind the thick trees. It had been several weeks since the ritual, and yet the feeling of something watching her, something lurking just out of sight, had never fully disappeared. "I know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes I feel like I'm still being followed. Like she's still there, just waiting." Hiro frowned, clearly worried. "You're not alone. We can all help you, Emiko. The Shadowless girl is gone, you've seen that. The ritual worked." But even as he spoke the words, Emiko felt a deep unease settle in her chest. She had wanted to believe that everything was over, that she had faced her fears and defeated the spirit that had haunted her. But deep down, she knew that something had changed, something more than just the Shadowless girl's presence. The forest wasn't done with her, and neither was the darkness. That night, as Emiko lay in bed, the same feeling returned. The silence of her small room was broken only by the soft creaks of the house settling, the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. But it wasn't the wind she heard. No, it was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging, coming from the forest. Emiko sat up suddenly, her heart racing in her chest. The familiar chill crept over her, the air growing thick with dread. She didn't need to look out the window to know that the Shadowless girl was out there. She could feel her presence, like a cold weight pressing against her chest, suffocating her. But this time was different. The footsteps weren't fading into the distance, like they had the night of the ritual. They were getting closer. The sound reached the front door, the dragging steps coming to a halt just outside her window. And then the knock came, a soft, hollow tap, like the gentle rapping of a finger against the wood. Emiko's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, tried to get out of bed, but her body refused to obey. Her legs felt like stone, her chest tight with panic. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. Her mind screamed for her to run, to do anything, but she couldn't move. The darkness outside had already seeped into her room, suffocating her thoughts, erasing her will. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning under the weight of some unseen force. And there, standing in the doorway, was the girl with no shadow. The air in Emiko's room grew colder than ice, and the lanterns flickered and dimmed as the Shadowless girl stepped inside. Her hair hung in front of her face, obscuring her features, but Emiko could feel her eyes burning into her. The girl didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to send shivers crawling down Emiko's spine. Emiko was frozen, unable to do anything but stare at the girl, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure before her seemed to be made of shadows, her skin so pale it looked as though it could be a part of the moonlight itself. There was no shadow beneath her feet, No reflection of her form in the dark, only an empty space that seemed to absorb the light around her. "I've come for you, Emiko," the voice came again, this time not from the girl's mouth, but from all around her, as though the very walls were whispering her name. "You cannot escape." Emiko's blood ran cold. It was the same voice, the same feeling she had sensed in the forest all those weeks ago. The girl with no shadow wasn't just a spirit, she was something deeper, something ancient, bound to the land itself, bound to her fears. "Please," Emiko whispered, her voice trembling. "I've already faced you. You're gone. You've lost." But the shadowless girl didn't respond. Instead, she took another step forward, her eyes finally visible beneath the curtain of her hair. And in those eyes, Emiko saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just emptiness anymore. There was something darker, something more sinister. The girl was smiling, a twisted, hollow grin that stretched far too wide for any human face. And then, without warning, the girl reached out, her hand extending toward Emiko. The air seemed to distort around her, the room warping as though time itself was bending under the weight of her presence. The last thing Emiko saw before she was consumed by the darkness was the shadowless girl's hand, slowly moving toward her chest. When the villagers found Emiko the next morning, there was no sign of struggle. Her room was quiet, as if nothing had happened. But Emiko was gone. The bed was undisturbed, the door still slightly ajar. Hiro was the first to notice. He had arrived at her house early, hoping to check in on his friend after the unsettling conversation the night before. But when he found her gone, the sense of dread that had been building in his chest grew unbearable. He rushed to the edge of the forest, calling out for her, but there was no answer. Only the wind, howling through the trees. The villagers gathered, their voices hushed in fearful speculation. "She was taken," Grandmother Suki murmured, her eyes clouded with sorrow. "The shadowless girl has taken her." And so the village once again fell into silence, haunted by the memory of the girl who had disappeared into the shadows. Weeks passed, and once again, the village was left with its unanswered questions, its lingering fears. No one spoke of Emiko. Her name had become a quiet whisper, carried only in the wind. But in the stillness of the night, the sound of dragging footsteps could sometimes be heard, just beyond the edge of the village. And the shadowless girl, with her hollow eyes and twisted smile, was never truly gone. The village never truly recovered from Emiko's disappearance. The once bustling streets became quieter, the whispers of her name fading into the winds that blew relentlessly from the forest. The villagers lived in fear, and the shadowless girl, though unseen, was always present, just beyond the trees. But in the dark recesses of the village, a new fear had begun to grow, one that would soon reach its breaking point. The children were disappearing once again. It started small. A child would vanish in the middle of the night, their parents waking to find their beds empty, the rooms undisturbed. Then another child and another. Soon, the village was in full panic, the streets filled with frantic parents searching for their children, their voices hoarse from crying out their names. Hiro could not shake the thought of Emiko. He knew deep in his bones that something was wrong. Something had changed when she disappeared. The shadowless girl had not finished with the village, and now, she was taking more than just one soul. One cold evening, after another child had vanished, Hiro walked alone to the edge of the forest. His footsteps were heavy, his breath visible in the chilled air. The village was quiet behind him, but the forest seemed alive, breathing with the wind. It beckoned him forward, as though it had known this moment was coming, that he would come to confront the darkness that had claimed so many lives. Hiro paused at the clearing, the same place where Emiko had stood with the monk and the villagers not so long ago. The air was thick with the weight of history, of unanswered questions and broken promises. He could feel the chill creeping into his bones, and a strange sense of dread washed over him. The night felt endless, as though time had slowed to a crawl. As he stood there, his eyes scanning the shadows, something moved in the darkness. At first, it was just a flicker, a slight shift in the air, a whisper of something watching him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. the girl with no shadow. She stood just beyond the trees, her figure pale against the dark backdrop of the forest. Her hair hung long and lifeless, her face obscured by the strands, but Hiro knew it was her. There was no mistaking her. The shadowless girl took a step forward, her feet dragging across the ground, her presence as chilling as ever. Her hollow eyes, deep and black, fixed on Hiro, and he felt the air grow colder, the weight of her gaze pressing on him like a physical force. "Emiko," Hiro whispered, his voice breaking. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward again, her movement slow and deliberate. The distance between them grew shorter with each step she took, until there was only a few feet separating them. Hiro's heart pounded in his chest, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. "You were always so close," the girl's voice echoed, not from her mouth, but from the very air around him. It sounded like the wind, like the rustling of leaves, but there was something deep and hollow about it, an emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. "Why her?" Hiro demanded, his voice raw with pain. "Why Emiko? Why us?" The shadowless girl tilted her head, as if considering his words. Her smile stretched across her face, wide and twisted, revealing too many teeth. "She was the one who saw me. She was the one who understood what I needed." A cold shiver ran down Hiro's spine. Emiko had known. She had known what the shadowless girl wanted, even if no one else had. "She understood me," the girl whispered, her voice soft now, almost mournful. "She was the first to notice, the first to feel me watching. She was the first to accept me." Hiro stepped back, his legs shaking beneath him. But you took her. Why?" The girl took another step forward, her presence growing more powerful with each movement. "Because I am the darkness," she said. "I was forgotten by those who were supposed to protect me, and I will be remembered, forever." The air around Hiro grew even colder, and the shadows deepened, swirling around the girl like a storm. He could feel the pull of her presence, the way she drew the light from the world around them. He knew then what she was. Not just a spirit, not just a cursed child. She was the embodiment of the village's deepest fears, the darkness that they had ignored for so long, the things they had let slip into the shadows. "Why take the children?" Hiro asked, his voice trembling, barely a whisper. The girl's smile grew wider. "They remind me of myself, of what I was before. I take them so that they never forget, so that they know what it feels like to be left in the dark." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The wind whispered through the trees, and Hiro stood frozen, his eyes locked on the girl's black, hollow eyes. But in that silence, something else stirred, a sense of urgency, a growing tension in the air that he couldn't ignore. The shadows around them deepened, drawing in closer. And then, without warning, the girl lunged forward. But Hiro didn't move in fear. He had seen enough. He had felt the weight of the darkness that had claimed Emiko, that had claimed so many others. This time, he wouldn't let her take another child. With a cry, Hiro reached into his pocket and pulled out the small charm Emiko had once given him, the one she had carried with her for years. It was simple, a small wooden figure tied with red string, a symbol of protection. He had thought it was nothing more than a trinket, a gift of friendship. But now it felt heavier than ever. He held it up, his hands shaking, and as he did, the air seemed to shift. A force, invisible and powerful, pressed against him, pushing back against the girl. The shadows seemed to writhe, twisting and recoiling from the charm. "No," the shadowless girl hissed. "You cannot fight me. I am the dark. I am the forgotten." But Hiro stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands steady with determination. "I will not let you take anyone else." The girl screamed, a sound so shrill it made Hiro's ears ring. The shadows around her twisted and writhed, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. And then, with a final, echoing cry, she vanished into the night, her presence fading like smoke in the wind. Hiro stood alone in the clearing, panting, his heart still racing. The charm in his hand pulsed with warmth, its energy still lingering in the air. He glanced around, the forest now eerily silent. The danger had passed for now, but he knew this wasn't over. The Shadowless girl hadn't been destroyed. She had only been pushed back, and soon she would return. And when she did, Hiro would be ready. Back in the village, the fear of the Shadowless girl had only grown. Children still disappeared, one by one, and the village seemed trapped in an endless cycle of terror. No one could explain why, but they all knew the truth. Something was still haunting the land, something ancient and unstoppable. The Shadowless girl's grip on the village was tightening once again, and Hiro, having seen the darkness for himself, knew that he was the only one who could stop her. The ritual, the charm, and the spirit that had once haunted Emiko's life had to be confronted one last time. The village, still trembling under the grip of the Shadowless girl's haunting presence, had grown even more desperate. Hiro had become obsessed, spending sleepless nights searching through ancient scrolls and speaking with elders. He was certain that the Shadowless girl was not just an apparition, but something far older, a force tied to the very land itself. The charm Emiko had given him was a key, he believed, a link to whatever held the girl in the dark. One evening, as Hiro stood at the edge of the forest, contemplating his next steps, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "Hiro!" He turned slowly. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Emiko, but something was wrong. Her face was pale, her hair wild, and her eyes were hollow, like the girl who had haunted them all. Her smile, too wide, sent a wave of unease rippling through Hiro. "Emiko?" His voice cracked as he stepped toward her. You're alive?" She nodded, her gaze steady on him. "I've been waiting for you. But you were taken. I saw her take you." She stepped forward slowly, the wind tugging at her clothes. "No, Hiro. She didn't take me. I became her." The words hit Hiro like a slap. He staggered back, his heart skipping a beat. His mind raced. This couldn't be right. Emiko couldn't have. No, it was impossible. "I don't understand," he whispered. "You never understood, Hiro," Emiko continued, her voice soft but heavy with a strange sorrow. "I was the one who broke the balance. I saw her when no one else did. I invited her in unknowingly. And when I was taken, I became part of her." She lifted her hand to her chest, as though to show him something, but Hiro's eyes were already wide with realization. "You were the one who invited her?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emiko smiled again, a smile that was not her own. "Yes, and now I'm hers forever." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The Shadowless girl had not been a random spirit, nor some forgotten entity bound to the land. She was a force that needed a vessel, someone to carry her, to sustain her, and to bring her power back to life. Emiko had been that vessel. She had unknowingly offered herself to the darkness, and when she had disappeared, it wasn't just that she had been taken. She had become part of it. "But why are you here now?" Hiro's voice was barely audible, caught between horror and disbelief. "Because you have been chasing me, Hiro," she said, her voice colder now, more sinister. "You've been chasing me all this time, thinking you could stop her. But you can't. She is me now, and I am her." A sickening chill swept through Hiro. The charm he held tightly in his hand. Emiko had once given it to him to protect him. He had believed it was a shield, a way to protect the village from the Shadowless girl. But now he understood. It wasn't a weapon at all. It had been a binding, a tether to the curse. As Emiko stepped closer, Hiro felt his limbs freeze. The shadows around her seemed to grow, thickening, swirling. They crept toward him like tendrils, drawing him into their cold embrace. "No," he gasped, clutching the charm tighter, as if it might save him. But it was too late. Emiko's eyes locked onto his, and the air around them thickened. "You were never meant to stop her, Hiro. You were meant to join us." The darkness closed in. Hiro tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He could feel the weight of Emiko's presence, no, the girl's presence, bearing down on him, like an unseen force tearing him apart from within. The next morning, the village was eerily quiet. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets. But there were no signs of Hiro, no signs of the children who had gone missing. Nothing. The villagers searched, but there was no trace of him, just an empty, oppressive silence. And then, in the heart of the forest, something changed. The trees whispered in the wind, but it wasn't the voice of the shadowless girl anymore. It was Emiko's voice, faint but clear. "It's over, Hiro. We are one now. We will never be forgotten." And so, the village fell under the weight of the curse once again. But this time it was different. The girl with no shadow had a new vessel, a new form, and the cycle would never end. As time passed, the villagers whispered tales of the girl with no shadow and the boy who had once tried to stop her. But now they were just stories, passed down from one generation to the next. The village had forgotten the truth, but the curse remained. And sometimes, when the wind was still, the shadows would stretch far beyond the forest, creeping slowly toward the village. The footsteps would return, dragging slowly in the night, a chilling reminder that the darkness was always watching, and it would never let them forget.